Hello folks, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at one of the most famous horror short stories of all time and somebody who's very influential in the genre, and that's M.R. James. We're going to be taking a look at his short story Count Magnus here in a moment. Now, the book that I'm going to be showing you today that we're going to be kind of talking about is actually a Penguin classic that is a collection of all of his horror works. He only wrote maybe about 15 or 16 different short stories in the horror genre. And so this little collection here is going to have them all. I'll link you to this later on in the comments below. But what I want to do is take a look. Now, for those of you who may not know, because this is a guy who wrote like in the late 1800s, but really he was really big in the early 1900s. This is a guy who really influenced the horror genres in a lot of major ways. And a lot of different stories and subgenres in horror and so forth will follow that have definitely taken a step from M.R. James. In fact, M.R. James is actually somebody who's very heavily, even though he only has a small number of short stories, he's very heavily, and they're all short stories, he's very heavily anthologized and chronicled and so forth. And many of my own horror short story collections, are, if you look in the shelves, are going to actually have his stuff in it because of how well received he was during the time and how influential he is. He's also very easy to read, too, as going back to him. Even though he wrote during the same time, as the era as a lot of other of these, horror writers, and he's not like an Ambrose Bierce or an H.P. Lovecraft, or somebody before Lovecraft, who might be more complex, like an Arthur Machen, who might have a very dense writing style, and so forth. He's not, or even an Algernon Blackwood, he's not, like that. He's much more of a sort of down-to-earth writer who's bringing a lot of sort of that down-to-earth styles. Now, one of the things he tries to do in order to bring sort of the horror genre kind of to the modern world is that he really wants to have and ground his works with a sense of reality. So he doesn't have the sort of traditional Gothic underpinnings and so forth. So for that reason, a lot of his stuff will be very quick to read. It'll be very easy. It'll seem very realistic. That actually, I think, adds to the horror aspects to the genre, because this is something that could happen right next door to you and so forth. So I think that James is where you're going to start to see this sort of move in the classic genre from these sort of Gothic stories, from Dracula and so forth, or the bigger, giant, larger-than-life stories of, say, H.P. Lovecraft, to more of a sort of common, everyday, this is realistic settings, realistic things that are happening, and so forth. However, having said that, he's still not there yet. What he is going to do, though, is he's going to really kind of begin sort of the antiquarian tales, because he is an antiquarian himself. So who's M.R. James? M.R. James was somebody who was born up in the UK. He lived his entire life out that way. He was an antiquarian. And what I mean with that is he was somebody who loved history, loved learning about things, loved learning about ghost stories, things like the occult and so forth. That was definitely something that fascinated him. He was also a well-known theologian and professor who was at a few different colleges, including Oxford, during his time there. But he's going to write most of his major short stories in the horror genre in the early 1900s, and we're going to take a look at Count Magnus here in a moment. And Count Magnus is going to be written, I think, in 1904 as part of a collection called the kind of ghost stories of an antiquarian. And this is going to be one of his sort of antiquarian stories that's going to kind of begin this. And this sort of antiquarian story, and you're going to see this too in Count Magnus, and I think this is probably one of the best examples of it in the early era, is your main character is going to be an antiquarian who is going to, and in this case it's going to be a found journal by an antiquarian. The plot device is going to introduce you on the first page of Count Magnus to a person who's actually researching and found this in a house that they recently purchased, and it's going to have the journals of this antiquarian from decades ago. And that's going to become a very common trope within the antiquarian horror genre and so forth, the found lost document and so forth. But again, it's definitely something that was new at the time and a new style of writing at the time. Anyway, so you had the lost document and so forth, and we'll go over this antiquarian's journey. Now, in this case, the antiquarian is a gentleman from England who's actually writing a travel log And he's writing his travelogue in the 1860s, in the early 1860s, in 1861. He's already published at least one travel book for Brittany, which is in France, and so forth. So now he is doing research in an area in Sweden that had really sort of hit him. So he's going to head on out to Sweden. He's going to hang out for a while in Sweden itself, and as a part of that, he's going to be introduced to this local town, and one of the big characters of this town is going to be Count Magnus, who lived hundreds of years ago, and was this big, larger-than-life figure who's a member of the nobility family that he's actually researching, because as a part of his travel book, he's going to be putting in, like, who are the local families that were big, noble families that are big in Sweden, some of their histories and so forth, and he'll put that in there as a part of his travelogue, so that if you want to go to Sweden, you can see these castles and see these churches, right, and so forth, graveyards, and so forth, can be a part of your journeys. And so he puts that in there as a part of the history. That's what he did with his book in Brittany, and that's what he's going to be doing with his Sweden book. So now he's exploring, doing some research, and so forth. And as he comes across this Count Magnus, he finds out that Count Magnus is actually somebody who has a dark reputation, somebody who went on what some locals call a Black Sabbath. And that's going to start the researcher for Count Magnus down into sort of a dark sort of thing. Now, I'm going to stop that sort of quick summary right there. It's already like half of the way through there, but it's only like a 12-page short story. So it's not like you still got half of it left, but yeah, you get the idea. But again, that's sort of a dark journey, and obviously you're probably going to have a fun time, finding out where he's going to go, what he's going to find out, and what's going to end up happening to our person with the found documents and so forth. So there's going to be a number of different things you're going to do some research on. But then, that this idea of this antiquarian, this researcher going back and researching some secrets that were mostly forgotten or hidden away, it's going to be a common sort of trope, basically, of horror. And so you're getting a chance to kind of see this early on as it's being laid of this groundwork and this foundation of this house and researches and so forth that you're going to see again and again and again. And you're going to see a lot of different horror writers come back to this main style of writing, and this kind of a style of an antiquarian ghost story, if you will, or antiquarian horror story, if you will. And so this is, again, a real, very big one. Now, if you take a look, you're going to find a lot of people both think really highly of M.R. James, as well as this story, Count Magnus in particular. For example, H.P. Lovecraft will say that Count Magnus is one of his top 10 horror short stories of all time, and so forth. And there are many other people who will have it also as well. And that's probably why, when you look at this book, it's called Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories. It's actually named after Count Magnus. That's how famous this story is. That's how much this story sells him. And that is, I believe, the single most, of the stories in here that he wrote, it's the one that's the most anthologized, because I think it is the most popular and so forth. So that's what we're going to start at. I will probably do at least one or two more short stories in here coming up soon to kind of give you a feel for some of his other stuff too. Although Count Magnus isn't particularly unusual. He does have a few other stories in here too that are kind of antiquarian too, which we'll take a look at probably soon. But again, I wanted to put him on your queue if he wasn't for horror writing, because not only is he writing contemporarily to some of the biggest names in horror and some of the most important names in horror, but he's also doing it with a different sort of view, this different sort of handle. His more grounded, more realistic way is very much a different style of horror at the same time as an Arthur Machen or something like that. And so I think it's very, very interesting, or the Yellow King, or even, or something like that. So there's a lot of these different sort of things out there that his stuff is writing, I think, against, much more simply, much more grounded, and so forth. And there's value in that. I think I really do. And so I wanted to put that on your queue if you've never heard of him or anything like that. But he is considered, again, one of these sort of early masters. Now, again, his stuff is very easy to read intentionally. None of his short stories are going to be longer than like 20 or 22 pages. And this one was like 12. And that's about average. I think most of his short stories in the bigger collections are probably going to be 12 or 13 or 14 pages for you. I went ahead and reread this short story now. It's probably the third time I probably read it. Or maybe fourth. But I read it for you earlier today, so I'd be fresh in my mind and so forth when I gave you some sort of a deep dive into the story, but it's not, it didn't even take me half an hour to reread it. Of course, again, I'm familiar with the story and so forth, but it probably took me like 25 minutes to go back and reread it. It was not a long read, although to be fair, I've read it before. It probably took me more like 45 minutes to read it the first time. But you get the kind of the key ideas of who the character is, or who he is as a writer, and so forth. So that's M.R. James's Count Magnus. So have you read it? What did you think about it? I'd love to talk with you about it more. Did you agree or disagree with anything in this video, or anything in here kind of resonate with you as a viewer? If you watch this video, hey, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. I really do appreciate it. We all have such busy days and busy lives. So the fact that you spent any amount of time with me is something that I really appreciate. It's very humbling. Thanks. And if you like this video, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be so many more videos to come with reviews of classic and forgotten works in fantasy, science fiction, and horror. So once again, thanks for your time.